Here we go. Super duper long episode. You guys ready? 42 minutes. Can I get this close to double? I don't know if I will be able to. Let's hope nothing goes wrong during recording. Anyways, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Sending out a lot of love. This is the Conspiracy Theory Iceberg, Part 9, 3 of 3. Here we go. And then it's on to the final tier, right? Let me see real quick. It's on to the final tier, right? It's been a journey. It's been a journey to revisit all of these with a nice guy named Wendigoon and a bunch of lovely people who are watching my video of me watching Wendigoon. You guys are awesome. Yep, I think this is it after this one. The final depths of the Conspiracy Theory Iceberg, which is 52 minutes. And then he has a tier list for it. Well, as always, much love and moonlight. And then I see your guys' comments. I'm definitely going to check out the other types of icebergs and everything. There's a Walking Dead iceberg? Wow. Yeah, okay. Let's get into it. Let's see if I last. Let's see if I stay alive. I'm going to sit up. Here we go. But right before we begin, actually, go get some snacks. Go get a drink of water. Go get some juice. Just get I don't know. If maybe you're getting ready to work out when you're watching this. Maybe you're doing some work. Maybe you got a project and this is on your second monitor. Maybe this is just on your phone, on a speaker. But get comfy. And now let's go.
Hello everybody and welcome to Tier 9 Part 3 of the Conspiracy Theory Iceberg. I know it's been a while and I'm so sorry about that. I want to thank you all so much for your patience. But as the channel's been growing and for the month of October, I really wanted to double down on these long sort of one-off horror stories. So I know there wasn't an episode for a month and I highly appreciate you all being very kind and patient with that. But I hope to not only do this one, but to get the final part out relatively soon, so look forward to that. That being said, as always, I have to carve out a lot of time to research for these videos in particular, because they're always very intensive. But I absolutely love doing this and couldn't imagine doing anything else. Like when it gets to the point, I have to use a link from a 4chan thread on the Wayback Machine to find a website talking about demon parasites. I know I've really found my calling. So I'm excited to talk about it, as I'm sure you are to hear about it. But before we get to that, as always, gotta find a way to keep the lights on. So I brought someone on for today's ad. Hello everybody. You may be wondering who this strange man is, and he is going to help us out with the ad today. This video is sponsored by Ridge Wallet. And I've talked about Ridge so many times on this channel. At this point, they pretty much sponsored the Conspiracy Theory Iceberg. And I'm
gonna skip it. But it's good to see him.
We're back to the video.
Yeah. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but
right.
As always, thank you for watching, and thank you for sticking with me this far into the iceberg and getting me from where I began at the beginning of this year to 780,000 subscribers at the time of recording. I've been blessed beyond belief, and it's thanks to you all. So, sincerely, thank you for watching. Holistic tubes is a specific kind of alternative medicine, specifically a type of alternative medicine that relies on charged metals. Whenever most people think of alt medicine, they think of things like herbal remedies or stretching and meditation. Well, this would be like alt medicine. The idea behind holistic tubes is that the majority of sicknesses or illnesses that people encounter come from a place of negative energy. A lot of this goes back to things I've talked about earlier, like spiritual chakras or energy gathering beings and things like that. While there are different theories on how these tubes are charged, a majority of them say something like magnetized tubes or potentially energy charged tubes, such as a sort of battery. A lot of these I saw had to do with ear infections, so the idea that you could take a metal rod, magnetize it, put it in your ear, and get pain relief. If this were to be true, it would obviously lead to more revelations in science, such as ideas of how energy is determined and what illness truly is. But that belief has several practitioners and users to this day. Cuneiform language and technology.
Cuneiform. I don't know much about the holistic tube thing. There's a book. I gotta remember the name of the book. Let me know if anyone knows. It's something What's the name of the book? I think it's something of the pharaoh. What is it? Is it the pharaoh? Okay. You know what I think? Is if I get the name of the book, I'll put it down below. It's like my mind is there. It's trying to say the name of the book, but I can't remember. It is. Wow, that is so cool how that fucking works. It felt like my mind was literally flipping through folders. There's a book called the Isis Thesis or Theory or something, where a bunch of, I think this is the book, I could be wrong, someone get the book and read it, tell me if I'm wrong. If it's not that book, then that book will reference another book. But the lady who wrote that book and did a bunch of studies, there's a bunch of what do you call them, testimonials from scientists and everything. You know, he says like this would be kind of like not revolutionary, but it would bring new scientific things to the table. It would not. It's just like more hidden knowledge that these certain methods can help you. But on the topic of energy, in that book, it talks about how illness and disease and all those things are already coded into your DNA. So it's basically like this. Say you're someone who feels like they have no purpose. They're basically done with life. And you kind of feel like it's pretty much, fuck it. Fuck this. I'm never going to find my purpose, blah, blah, blah. Well, then in your DNA, something will activate to cause cancers or sickness or things like that. It's already in your body. So once you just align yourself with being like that, like, oh, I'm pretty much finished. I know this is a really safe thought, right? But I guess it gives you a purpose not to think negative. Basically, you think low and you're like, my life's pretty much over. Then that disease in your body is like, oh, yeah, well, yep, you're right. Okay. And then activates and you come down with something like cancer. The doctor will find some random illness. And the Isis Thesis or Theory, whatever the fuck it's called. If this book, you know, if you believe in this book, then it's like, there's also the things where a doctor will tell someone, oh, there's a 1% chance this person will survive. But all of a sudden, when they turn their life around or believe that they are not going to die, then all of a sudden they don't die, or they turn it, or that they're that 1 in a million person that survives. That's why, because it's like the idea that disease and sickness are all mental. Yeah, it's a crazy book, but it just made me think about that.
Is relating back to the idea of cuneiform language, which is essentially a sort of old world written language that relied more on symbols and logos rather than pronunciation and words as we know today. You can think of this as things like old Mesopotamian text or things like Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now,
another cool thing about hieroglyphics and things, and I'm pretty sure this has been said, we had a discussion in school about this, but I'll just tackle this one real quick before we move on. This is a form of cuneiform too. These. Yep. It's just a new age form of it. You can throw down some of those symbols and it's like universally known. Like when you send it to someone. So it's a form of cuneiform. It's funny.
There is a specific type of programming language referred to as cuneiform because it uses symbols very similar to that of cuneiforms. The greater theory behind it comes back to ideas of relearned intelligence. Or in other words, people thousands and thousands of years ago decided the best form of writing was that through symbols and logos. And then sure enough, in modern technology, there seems to be examples of people relearning what was once known. Now, while the theory partially ends there, and it's just the idea that people continuously relearn whatever the highest order of information is, we can have more fun with it and apply that back into the Great Reset theory, or the idea that humanity works in cycles on
yeah, everything's just copied, nothing new under the sun.
The same planet Earth. If that were true, then perhaps the ancient people who wrote the first cuneiforms got their inspiration from the remnants that were left behind by what we would consider a modern society, and then that modern society got it from the previous group of old-time people, and so on and so forth. Essentially creating an almost paradox of information that is passed on from yourself within the previous cycle. Bhutanese shadow market refers to the
That was cool.
landlocked country that resides between India and China in the East Himalayas, known as Bhutan. Now, initially, ideas...
I'm not gonna lie, this photo looks like something out of Shadow Warrior. Man, turn this off. Ugh.
around the Bhutanese shadow market, as it was referred to online, was pretty much your standard ideas of a sort of black market organ trade. And while that would normally be as deep as the theory goes, we're on tier 9, so you know it gets worse. According to those who have interacted with the shadow market, it is not a physical or in-person trade as we would know it, but instead a spiritual storefront. In other words, the only way to access anybody in the shadow market is through meditation and contacting them within a spiritual realm. From there, this supposed shadow market that is operated by Bhutanese monks sells a plethora of forbidden or sacred spiritual goods. And supposedly these goods that they sell are spiritual items such as the life elixir, which can make someone be immortal, human souls trapped within jars, and things like curses in bottles. So essentially, if one reads a high enough plane of understanding but wants to have their hands on nefarious items, they could use their plane of understanding to contact one of the monks within the Bhutanese shadow market and then buy things like human souls and magic capable items off of them. You know, sometimes I say stuff like that and then I think to myself, like, wouldn't it be funny if someone heard that out of context? But at this point in the iceberg, I think I'd just be committed. Hydrophobia experiments is essentially another name for...
That's freaking insane. Well, someone who feels like they're powerful enough in meditation should get out there and try it. No, you shouldn't. Now, if I get committed Minecraft leave server for promoting that, yeah.
Rabies experiments. See, rabies was originally known as hydrophobia, at least back whenever Louis Pasteur was developing his vaccine for it. The reason for this being creatures that were infected with rabies and showing symptoms of it had a strong aversion to water. The reason for this...
I was about to say that. I was like, why is it hydrophobia? But
is the rabies virus causes such an intense swelling of salivary glands that it makes it hard to swallow. So if a subject tries to swallow water, they begin to choke and throw up. Ironically, the intense salivation and high body temperature makes the patient very, very thirsty, so it's a very tragic and slow way to die.
Damn.
However, as you probably know, rabies is most famous for the deranged nature that it gives to the people who are infected by it. Well, see, that's where these experiments come in. So rabies itself is a form of a single-strand RNA virus. Now, without getting into all the details of what that means, one of the things that it means is that it can mutate very, very easily. To put it in perspective, things like the common cold and the flu are also single-strand RNA viruses, and there's new versions of them several times a year. So the theory is, since this is not only a very scary but a very infectious and mutatable pathogen, there have been countries that have done experiments on rabies in order to make a sort of bioweapon. The reason it's referred to as hydrophobia experiments is because people infected by it, it's not exactly rabies anymore because it's been combined with the flu and syphilis and a bunch of other diseases in order to make this new disease. However, the commonality through all of them is that the patient still experiences hydrophobia, so the disease is just called hydrophobia. But you can absolutely think of it as a zombie plague because according to the theory, that's exactly what it does. There are supposed logs that exist from Russia within the 1980s and the Cold War in which Russia kind of had the idea that if anyone decided to destroy them, they would have a sort of dead man switch, that they could give a final middle finger and infect the world with this sort of zombie plague, or in this case, the hydrophobia experiment. Supposedly, the patients within these hydrophobia experiments weren't just out of their head and frothing at the mouth, but they were particularly violent, trying to kill not only each other but anyone else who was nearby, after dying 2 to 3 weeks in from dehydration. There are even theories that say during the Iraqi conflict, one of the reasons that there was so much containment measures and countries like the US were so hesitant to leave is because there had been stolen samples of the hydrophobia virus throughout the Middle East. And that one of the reasons world governments were so shady about what their involvement in the Middle East was is because they didn't want to alert worldwide panic by saying we're looking for the zombie plague. Which, to be fair, could be, you know, kind of concerning. Phantom time was a theory proposed by Heribert Illig. Essentially, the main idea behind it is that our modern understanding of history since the death of Christ is largely made up, or at the very least, the timeline is. According to him, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and the Pope of the same time, Sylvester III, put together this sort of idea in order to justify their placement of power. According to the theory, they essentially added several hundred years to history, which conveniently placed them at the year of 1000 AD. Without getting into the politics of it, there was this whole battle over who had the divine right to Europe, and it looked a lot better for Otto and the Pope if they were exactly 1,000 years since the death of Christ, because that made them sound really good according to prophecies that were given. However, this did things like make the entire Carolingian, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but the Carolingian period of history completely non-existent, as well as significant figures like Charlemagne would not exist. The idea being that Otto made these characters up within history books as a means of further justifying their placement in history. According to Herabert's theory, specifically the years of 614 AD to 911 AD were made up, or in other words, 297 years of history. His reasons for this are ideas like Gregorian calendar, as it's written, has these gaps in its understanding and seems it was kind of pushed as a means to follow this new narrative, as well as things like Isaac Newton doing the math on the history of eclipses and realizing there's about a 300-year gap in history of when these eclipses took place, and as well as archaeology, since it seems that nearly no large structures were constructed within that 300-year time span, which it would be really weird if no significant empires built anything for 300 years of time and seemingly no new roadways or conquests were made. Again, the idea being that as a means of justifying their placement as rulers over the Holy Roman Empire, these two characters shifted the course of history as we know it forever. Null compliance security is a theory that...
Wow, that was a mouthful. I could see that one though.
That I've got to be careful with, because all the people involved are still people who are running things and organizations, and I'm not going to go into details because I do not want to be unalived. Yeah. But to give the sort of vague on details version, in 1997 there was an experiment that took place within a Florida prison system. The idea behind this experiment, which took place between the works of several medical schools and drug companies, was to find a long-term sedation for very violent inmates. Supposedly in 1997, this group began giving these specific medications to very violent inmates who were serving life sentences, and after only 40 days, the subject suffered from a permanent sense of total compliance, which is a fancy doctor way of saying that they had their higher cognition and abilities completely stripped from them. This turned what was otherwise violent inmates into essentially vegetative people walking around without really any sense of cognition or understanding. Supposedly this went on for 10 years.
So I was about to say like the servitors or whatever they're called from Warhammer 40k, but no, I think they keep their consciousness.
And this was conducted on 845 inmates, most of which are still alive and existing within the justice system as sort of mentally ill patients to this day. So essentially the theory is saying that because they can't perform normal lobotomies to shut up people that they're not fond of, they've now found a way to perform chemical lobotomies. Phlogiston theory resurfacing is in reference to a very old world belief of the phlogiston theory. Essentially, the theory said that anything that had the ability to catch on fire and burn contained an element or particle known as phlogiston. The idea being, if you are a creature that is capable of combusting, so I imagine all of us, you are just filled with the particle known as phlogiston. And then after you combust and your, burnt remains are lying there on the floor, you have now been dephlogistoned. And some things in the natural world, such as water, contain zero phlogiston whatsoever. But as time went on, we learned that fire was essentially a reaction of energy and of supercharged particles and yada yada. However, in recent years, it has been discovered that instead of a different kind of element, there is instead a fourth state of matter known as plasma. So this theory is saying that since we discovered a new state of matter, which has the capability of being what fire itself is, maybe in the future we will discover that there is a sort of trace particle that fire itself uses as a propellant. And then that opens up a whole new door of research. Like if people are flammable because they got the phlogiston in them or whatever, can we like take it out without you know, burning them first. Santiago interference relates to something known as the Santiago Theory of cognition. It's a theory of how cognition and life works that was developed by a series of biologists in Santiago, Chile, hence the name. Essentially, this sort of combination between biology and philosophy came to the conclusion that life cannot exist without cognition, and cognition itself cannot exist without life. So if something has both cognition, it must have life, and if something has life, it must have cognition. And consciousness, as we understand it, or the ability to think and be upright and be aware, is more so just cognition, but on a spectrum. And furthermore, these researchers define cognition itself as the ability to react to one's environment. So to kind of lay out what that whole theory is for you, say we have us as people, as we exist. We have cognition, or in other words, we have the ability to physically react or understand things that are happening around us. Okay. You're watching me talk right now, that information's coming through your ears, your brain is processing it, and you're able to understand the point I'm getting across through language. That is a form of cognition. You are observing things happening in your environment and able to adjust yourself, i.e. your thought pattern, because of it. Now let's take something else that we know to be alive, like a plant. Obviously, plants are alive, but you can't talk to a plant and make it understand you, at least, I think that was on the iceberg somewhere, actually. Anyway, for now, we can't talk to plants.
Yeah. Okay.
Plants. However, a plant absolutely does have the ability to react to its environment. Several plants will not only grow into the direction of sunlight, but they do things like reproduce, and some are able to shut off their waterways depending on if it's a dry or wet season. So even though that's not consciousness as we understand it, according to this definition, that is a form of cognition. So you can think of consciousness as the spectrum, grass being on the low end, us being on the high end, but everything within it having some different form of cognition. So that's the Santiago theory of cognition. So what would Santiago interference be? Well, that relates back to a concept known as cognitive interference. You know how sometimes you'll be sitting there and then you'll just have a really inappropriate or wrong thought run through your head? Like you weren't even thinking about anything in general. You can just be driving your car on the road, and then for some reason a split shot shoots through your brain that tells you to swerve the car off the road. This is a phenomenon known as cognitive interference. There's a lot of theories about why cognitive interference happens, but one of the more commonly accepted ones is that whenever you're not using your brain's cognitive function, it uses that free time as a time to sort of self-check itself. Or in other words, whenever you zone out, your brain has conversations with itself to confirm ideas that it's only suggested. Basically like this. You know, hopefully, that murder is a bad thing to do. However, you probably haven't sat down with yourself and thought like, murder bad, I don't like it. It's just something you generally understand. So because of that, you can be sitting in Pizza Hut and just chilling out, kind of zoned out, your brain vibing. So then your brain's like, hey, why I've got your attention for a second. Are you sure you don't want to kill that guy across from you? No? Okay, making sure. Just don't worry about it. Go back to your pizza. So if your brain uses free moments as a means of checking with itself what is both fears and considers evil, then what would potentially happen if someone had their entire cognitive senses removed? Ooh. There are theories, although hopefully no experiments that have ever been performed, of what could happen if someone had all of their sensory stimuli removed, or in other words, their sight, smell, taste, hearing, and touch. Theoretically, they would still maintain motor functions, but be trapped in this sort of shell in which they can't understand anything about their environment. So in this time of free total cognition, if we know the brain to give short spurts of evil and wrong whenever it has a chance, what happens if it can give really, really long spurts of it? And again, according to the Santiago theory of cognition, something cannot be alive without having cognition and understanding its environment. So in this state of between life and death, is that where a sort of purgatory resides, in which someone's mind gives them all these evil ideas and entraps them to within themselves? Santiago interference essentially asks the question, if something cannot be alive without being cognitive, then what is a living thing without that cognition? Elaine Moore Island is something that I covered in...
Okay, I'm not saying much. I think I have to cover some of these in different videos and literally by themselves to not make this super long. Because that one I want to touch on a little bit more.
Great detail in my Ocean Mysteries video, link in the description. But to give a short version here, in the year 1900, there were 3 lighthouse keepers who were set to run...
I heard this story. This one's crazy.
...the Elaine Moore Island lighthouse. However, while they were there, a heavy fog set in around the lighthouse. So heavy, in fact, the relief keepers were stalled a week from sailing out to the island. By the time they did eventually get there, the entire 3-man crew was missing. And by missing, I mean they totally vanished. There was still food set out on their table. All of the doors were shut. The beds were unmade. It's like they were going about their daily lives and just disappeared. However, what's most interesting about the story is the second mate's logbook of what events had occurred. In the logbook, he said that they experienced storms so turbulent and powerful that it caused these 3 lifelong sailors to come together and pray and cry. Before the final entry simply said, "Storm has stopped, God is over all," and then again, they were never seen. Now, what's interesting is Elaine Moore isn't far from the shores of mainland Scotland, and there were no storms reported within that time period. As a matter of fact, ships were going about their daily schedule. So these supposedly very centered storms that didn't affect anyone outside of them and the heavy fog on the area has led theorists to believe that perhaps the Elaine Moore Island lighthouse crew was experiencing a sort of dimensional rift. Or if things like dimensions can be torn into, perhaps the fogs was a show of them crossing over or something crossing over into their realm. And even if unwanted, this complete vanishing of the Elaine Moore Island lighthouse crew could be a sign of dimensional travel, or a sort of short-term purgatory imposed on them for some reason. I should also mention that this entire story was the inspiration for the Robert Edgars movie The Lighthouse, so do with that information what you will. Sphinx.
That would be really cool. It sounds like a dimensional rift open. I think he touched more. Oh, no. The video I watched was like 6. I think Mysterious Unexplained Stories for Frightening Fridays. But yeah, that one sounds cool. If they went through a dimensional rift, it doesn't sound like something coming in. It sounds like they went through something for sure. I'm gonna go with that one.
Sphinx water erosion hypothesis implications is an implication that the Sphinx is way, way older than we believe it to be. See, the generally taught version of history is that the Sphinx was built about 4,500 years ago. The reason for this is the earliest dated time in which Egyptians settled the land, so it makes sense that the Sphinx was built around that time. However, there are 2 main hangups with that theory. For one, the Sphinx is very, very sand and wind eroded compared to structures around it. Like, sure, the pyramids aren't in perfect...
Yeah, there's this theory I heard. I think this one must be a part of it, or must be it, that the Sphinx was there when they got there.
...condition. But the Sphinx is to a point that the nose is completely missing, and it seems to have been there for a much longer time. The second and more damning fact is that in the pit around the Sphinx and within the Sphinx itself, there is a form of heavy water erosion. Or essentially these lines that have ran through the stone are from some form of water that has poured over it. The issue with that being, that area of Egypt has not experienced significant rainfall to the point of causing any flooding in about 9,000 years. Because of this, that would mean that the Sphinx was there twice as long as we currently believe it to be. And you may be asking, what's the big deal with that? Well, the Egyptians are one of the first recorded civilizations that existed at least outside of the immediate Middle East, or on the fringe of the Middle East, one of the first civilizations moving into Africa. So if they existed 4,500 years before when we believe them to have currently existed, that messes up all the timelines. That would give ideas like religion more footholds in how they describe humanity departing and settling regions. And essentially, if you were to add 4,500 years to modern society's clock, then a lot more could have happened and a lot more things make sense than current science and theories say they do.
Yep.
Archontic genetic engineered entity.
The Demiurge. Oh, we're talking about Archons now? Wow. We'll see what he says and see if I say anything.
Oh boy. So I talked about Archons way back in the Iceberg, and I mentioned them as being essentially the demons within the religion of Gnosticism. And I don't really know anyone who's like a modern Gnostic, but just in case you're out there, I don't think they all believe in this. I think just a few of them, but I'm going to tell it anyway. So essentially the idea is there is a system within people called the gallbladder meridian. It starts in your ears and then connects in the middle of your brain and runs down your body and does some zigzags and eventually comes out on your fourth toe. The idea being this is the mainline control center for your body. So these Archons within Nostalgism, these demons, have developed these parasites that essentially look like jellyfish that they implant in people through their ears. The jellyfish go to their gallbladder meridian and then start out slow by suggesting things to people like, hey, we should lay back on talking to family members and we should become more reserved. And it essentially starts as sort of a voice in your back of your head, but then it starts to control little tiny muscle movements and eventually gets to the point where it just takes over the human host.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, okay, I'm starting to see it now. If you deep dive and just do... Yeah. That's actually funny. This is one of those cases of whatever he was talking about. What was it called? The whole spread of misinformation. But if you go and like look into Archons for yourself, they're nothing to what this sounds like.
The purpose...
And the even fact that he put a picture of the Demiurge here like shows that like literally has nothing to do with what he's saying. It literally sounds like misinformation.
Of this is for the Archons to one day develop a sort of zombie army through the use of these jellyfish parasites. And in reading this, there was a group of people known as the Star People who during the Orion Wars learned how to reach into someone's gallbladder meridian and pull out the demon parasite to keep them from being a part of the zombie army. I try to make jokes about some of it, but I just can't. We're moving on. Gnosticism be wild, and man, I'll tell you what. Ulfma is interesting. So I cannot find what the word Ulfma itself means. I believe it's an acronym since every letter is capitalized. However, if you search it on an alternate search site that isn't something like Google or Bing, you come to a search result for this book about Theosophy on the Amazon bookstore. The book was written by a man named Rudolf Steiner.
I like this picture. There's no religion higher than the truth.
Who was one of the earliest proponents of Theosophy. Theosophy is essentially the idea that there is one hidden truth within the world, and once that one truth is understood, it can be manipulated. And furthermore, there is a group of these sort of reality hackers who have figured out what the one truth is, and they are known within Theosophy as the Masters. Supposedly, these Masters exist as prominent figures throughout history who have manipulated their place within history because they understand how the universe works. So they can perform things like magic and witchcraft and stuff that we would consider unexplainable, but it's actually all logical because they just understand how things go together. So that's the core idea of Theosophy itself. It's really interesting that whatever Ulfma means, it for some reason brings you to a book by one of their founders. And if you go through the book reviews on that book on the Amazon store, there are several people mentioning how Theosophy is so great and how they better now understand the root of the Masters and all this wild stuff. It's fantastic. Egglish travel refers to a theory that probably deserves its own video from the 1980s known as Ong's Hat. Ong's Hat is a sort of abandoned town in New Jersey that was supposedly the place for this conspiracy theory. This is one of the oldest online stories on the internet, starting all the way back in the 80s on internet bulletin boards. According to the stories, a group of Princeton professors had done enough experimentation with things like quantum mechanics to develop a way to perform a form of dimension travel, or in other words, teleportation and potentially time travel. They did this with something known as the egg, which was essentially a device that they described made them capable of moving through dimensions. However, there were theories within this that said if they got to a point where they no longer needed the egg to travel, they could seemingly just time and reality hop at will with no issues. So all those pictures you see that supposedly looks like someone wearing modern day clothes back in like the 1950s, or someone with a cell phone during like the Civil War, the idea behind it is that these Princeton professors eventually developed a form of eggless travel and are now simply just messing with the timeline and hopping around and causing problems wherever. So good for them. Prolepsis is a concept within literary work.
I am going to take a quick break. All right, let's go.
Sphinx. And if someone is an
And you know what?
English
I'll
or-
touch on more things. You know, I'm not, because I'm being too silent. Okay. If you're at this part and you lasted this long, thank you. So my understanding of Archons, let's just get into it. You guys have been telling me, speak my mind on these videos. I'm tired of being silent about it. Okay. Archons. So what I've researched about Archons are like this. Archons are basically, they feed on you, first of all, and they're not a demonic parasite. But in a way, it's a parasite, so you could think about it like that. It feeds on you, kind of parasite, latches itself to you. But an Archon are basically entities that, let's see, where does this go back to? Come on, mine. You got the word. The Anunnakian people. So it has some connection to one of you know, those old ancient alien races that they created the Archons to basically, if I can connect this to another theory he talked about, which it could really be any theory, but the theory is that people are cattle here. You're basically you're a battery. Every emotion that you go through, everything that you experience is just feeding basically more of this machine. And you can even connect this to how the algorithm, you'll be talking about something like with your mom, your dad, your sister, your cousin, your brother, whatever, your friend, whoever. You'll talk to them, and then all of a sudden on your phone, an advertisement will pop up for whatever you were just talking about. So in a way, this is a connection that I just made in my mind, but AI could be a form of Archon. I'm not gonna lie, that just occurred to me that could be an Archon. But basically, it feeds on you, and when it finds out what you like, it'll continue to try to feed you that. But the emotions that you experience are indifferent. It just needs you to experience intense emotion. So the funny thing is, it's technically basically like, it doesn't matter what you do, an Archon will always be present. So this is a weird thing. So you know what, it'd be a bit more honest if I say what I want to say, but I'm gonna just reference it and not say it's anyone I know. But pretty much there are some people, when he was talking about the masters, who've gotten to a point where they even know a baby being born is one of the worst forms of Archons ever possible. Because when a baby is born, hope is reborn. If the family, you know, fortunately that the baby has a good family, where everyone is like, oh, look how cute and adorable it is. And this plays into the whole fact that any humanly thing you experience here in a tense emotion and don't get over will drag you back into this reincarnation loop where you'll basically die, and because of this one singular moment, you'll be reborn again. And that's the problem with the baby being born in a family, is the attachment. Is like, if it's one of those cliche lives where everyone, like, not every kid of like the mom or the dad or the aunts, like the brothers of the mom and the dad, their kids didn't become anything great, all falls on this new baby being born, and then hope gets reborn, and it's like not a confidence that the baby will be something great. So then that is basically Archon energy, is everybody. And when I want to try to reference it where I don't reference people too specifically, but I've met conscious people who are like, you know, they have a baby and they're like, this great baby, but you know, gonna give it its not like in a bad way, but help it go through like its traumatic experiences better, or prepare them more for the world, but let them really be their own entity and not connect too much to them. Still have the love connection and everything for them, but not get too connected to the point where you drop all your hope and your shit onto the baby, because that's practically what happens when a kid is born. I know a lot of people experience that right now, you know, and are still experiencing it, where they grow up and the reason they're in college or certain things like that is to prove something to their parents, or to, you know, not be, you know, just fall in line. Those are Archons basically feasting on you, and nothing you can even do about it. That's pretty much it. So it's like this whole inevitable thing where it's like, do you and experience and have fun and enjoy, because you're supposed to have fun, but don't, what was it, there's this cool saying, okay, so I don't know if I'm gonna remember the quote right, but I remember the first part of it, and it's like, thrills you should not stare. And basically, if I can break that down real quick, so it's thrills you should not stare. It's basically like, you should still partake in thrills, or still partake in whatever you want from this human experience, but do not be attached to it. So it's basically the art of letting go. Because you can even think about this with like breakups, and think about all the emotion that you experience through that. If it's heavy and crazy dense, you're just Archon food. It's basically your Archon food no matter what, because this is an energetic being. And I can tie into another thing where the powers that be understand this, because it's exactly why they put so much fear in the news. So like, people wake up and they buy into the news. That is Archons. So there's this theory that all the elites, this is why I say, don't worry, I won't be unalived after this video, but that's why I say it's 100% a distraction when people get into conspiracy theories and think the Illuminati is behind stuff, or the Masons are behind stuff. No, they serve a much higher being, which I don't know if it's the Anunnaki, I don't know if it's an AI. You know, like, there's a line from my favorite artist B.O.B. where he says, we don't know what could be at the top. It could be bots at the top. Like, you know, the invasions happened already. The bodies are already swapped. Like, you don't know what they serve, but thinking the Masons or Illuminati or these secret organizations are doing something is part of the distraction, because they have literally no power. The power is with you. You have to unlock your own mind. That's the purpose of them keeping you distracted so much, which ties into what he was saying back in the Santiago interference. And this is why I kind of got a little bit like flustered and didn't want to say anything, because it's like, these researchers find all of this and then don't apply conscious control of your mind. Because if you consciously control your mind, things like that don't happen. 100% you can get rid of cognitive interference or whatever, because I've seen it happen. And it's easier to just say I've seen it happen than say it's myself, because then you have to tie into whether you believe me or not. But like I said, when I tie in things like that, I'm like, well, I experienced it, so it doesn't matter if you believe it or not. Try it for yourself and do your research. But that's what I'm saying. I can tell where a lot of these are misinformation, where it's like trying to lead you off of wondering. And yeah, I think that's it for me. The Archon thing really stuck with me, because there's a picture of the Demiurge, and like, I'm not saying Wendigoon needed to touch on it, but he didn't touch on it, but he put the picture there. And actually, you know what? Fuck it. Since we're here, I'll show you. So the Demiurge is a being responsible for creating the universe. And then in Gnosticism, a heavenly being that's the subordinate to the supreme being, that is considered the controller of the material world, and antagonistic to all that is purely spiritual. So pretty much, I've had a video, you can go back and look at it. I can even pull up the message on my phone, where B.O.B. told me to keep my Demiurge in check. And the reason that is because, if you're tying back to things you've heard me say before, you are the universe, and everything is an extension of your mind. So the Demiurge is also you. That's how Archons are feasting on you, because in a theory, how he talks about the Great Reset, connecting back to this, it's you, basically. And I think he said it in the cuneiform too. An older version of yourself left this information for you to figure out later on. Boom. And that's how it all ties into each other. It's just copies of copies, repeating. And yeah, so basically, you're your own worst enemy, and you're the Archon, and control your urges, master your mind. And then when he talked about the whole masters thing in, where was it? Okay. So what I wanted to say here for this one was that, in theory, there's this thing that me and my cousin talk about, where we say unconscious people are way better at the law of attraction or manifestation, and just if there's someone who wants to be authentic and just stand out and be themselves, they're way better at manifesting, because they don't care about fitting into this whole, you can call it sheep side, you can whatever. They came to actually break the matrix. And yeah, and myself and probably you are even an example of this. So think about this. He's talking about it, separated from himself, But I wondered if he considers himself to be one of these people, because in theory, he is. Because any YouTuber like PewDiePie, yada yada yada, etc., you can say any of the ones that have made some sort of success for whatever that means for themselves, because I feel successful no matter whatever this, like he even said it, imaginary number shows, they will go down in history for somebody. Like there's that whole joke that people say like they won't be remembered, but he will be remembered by somebody no matter what. If he stopped YouTube one day, there will probably be a million people that were like, or maybe even half of that number that were like, you remember Wendigoon, that guy like that? So he in terms is one of these masters unconsciously, and just passed it over like it's not that. Or like, yeah, they found a way, like reality hackers. Basically everyone in reality who has created their own reality now, maybe financial freedom, whatever they work they put in, you can name so many people, they are reality hackers. There you go. And that's it. Ah, shit.
And how they better now understand the root of the masters and all this wild stuff. It's fantastic. Eggless travel refers to
we did eggless travel. I don't know about that. Eggless travel, funny. That makes me think about the movies you'll see where they're supposed to be filming them back in, like, I don't know, the Edo period, and like you'll see a dude with a bright, like a Gucci watch and Gucci bag. I don't fucking know.
Prolepsis is a concept within literary works, and if someone is an English or literature major and wants to call me out for it, that's fine, but I promise I try. Essentially, prolepsis is describing an event or alluding to an event before the event itself actually happens. In literature, this is phrases like he was a dead man when he came through the door, which implies and tells us that that character is going to die. However, he's not dead yet, it's just alluding to it. So apply that concept to history and humanity. There are several instances of this quote-unquote foreshadowing existing in history. Everything from religions describing what nations would rise and fall and who would take over, to things like art that's only recently been discovered being very similar to modern art. Now this implies one of two things.
The funny thing with this is also in music. You know what? I'll just go ahead and say it. Shout out to X. Maybe his energy is around because he's the first thing that popped in my head. All his music. If you go back and listen to it, he basically predicted his entire, well, not predicted, but foreshadowed his entire death. It was the weirdest shit for everybody to see, and everybody knows, and that's a form of prolepsis, I guess. But like I said, these terms are just slapped on top of it. Prolepsis.
It implies that there are inevitable conclusions that every society will reach, or in other words, it's like two separate experiments happening in two different points in time, and they each come to the same end result. Or you can have the really fun theory of the grand cycle that I love to talk about, and the idea that at some point, someone started a trend, and then it's just constantly being relearned and rediscovered by every society afterwards. Yep. This creates a sort of chicken and egg paradox, because there's no way of telling where it would have began if that was the case, but it's wild to think that modern people inventing stuff that was inspired by ancient works was inspired by modern people the last time through the cycle. Stonehead of Guatemala is referencing this image that was taken in the 1950s within Guatemala. For whatever reason, in the middle of a completely uninhabited area of the Guatemalan jungle, there is this giant statue of a head. The artwork does not match any of local or known societies' artworks of what faces or statues looked like. And furthermore, after the researchers went back to their home country, there was this big political war that took place in Guatemala, and whenever they came back years later, they couldn't find where it was. And since that's all the information we have on it, this is a giant that shot out of hollow earth, like it was down there, and it heard there were researchers, so it just like shot itself or a statue of itself out of the hollow earth. And then they took this picture, and then he thought it'd be really funny to hide it again. And that's what happened, and guess what? You can't prove me wrong, so we're just going to move on. The phone mafia is the idea that the majority of scam callers, as we know them to be, are actually part of a much larger and more grand body. Essentially, you know all those phone scans you get, things like...
You know what's funny with this? Before my closest bro, my dude Ron the Don, pretty much his grandpa before he died actually said something about this, and I don't know if it was confirmed, and maybe it's just confirmed now by everybody, but maybe it was just something that his grandpa said. with this whole phone mafia, he actually said that scam callers and stuff will call you, and if you don't say anything, like don't say anything at all, like, well, this happens sometimes to certain scam callers that call you, and if you answer, and it yeah, they just don't say anything, they hang up. Well, what his grandpa told them was, if you ever get a scam call or a call, wait to speak to see if they hang up, because it's this whole underground thing where they're recording your voice to basically make mock-ups, or they could use your voice later on to we did this in like a class I had. It was like, I think the class was like, it was either music, it was called music and something, where we basically did this too, where we took audio and it was like an audio version of deep fakes, but basically these phone callers call you, and if you speak, if it, like, you know, like sometimes the ones where maybe you'll go hello or say hello in your voice and then they hang up immediately, they're just getting little small clips of your voice to put together like an entire like audio deep fake, and who knows what they could do with that. But that's what his grandpa said before he died, and that was pretty crazy to think about, is that these scam callers call you, and it's like, yeah, part of this maybe phone mafia. I'm just saying maybe that's a connection. Oh wait, here we go.
Like the Nigerian prince, or the police saying you need to pay a speeding ticket, or cases saying that you have a relative who needs bailed out, etc. Well, we understand those to each be just one-off callers trying to make a quick buck. However, the idea is there is a much, much larger crime syndicate who just works through middleman as a means of getting money this way. Or in other words, they send an agent to hire a middleman to make the call, and if the middleman's ever caught, then he doesn't even know how to report to the police the people who got him to do it. If they are this expansive, then it would be global, and it would have to be an incredibly large organization. And people have made the relatively fair point of, if gangs and things like the mafia were such a huge deal for hundreds of years and then they just kind of disappeared, who's to say they didn't go into things like cyber or electronic theft? I also want to mention there's been a number of journalists and police officers who have investigated this, who have been found not alive. So to cover my bases on this, these are all jokes. Everything I'm saying is a joke. This YouTube channel is a joke. I'm a joke. Nothing that I'm saying is worth unaliving over. And this is to my audience. If for whatever reason in the future news comes out that I committed exit
no,
game,
he didn't.
No, I didn't. Approaching stars.
This is what I had to say in my old channels, bro. Especially when I talked about gang stalking. I'm gonna say that too. It was just a theory that they could be stealing your voice. I'm not sure if that's actually part of it. Like I said,
is the opposite.
So if I'm unalive, yeah, you know what happened. Maybe.
Of the expanding universe theory. So you know the idea that there is a Big Bang or some event that happened that created the universe, and because of that everything's kind of drifting apart from one unified center? Well, this idea is saying that perhaps that center developed its own gravitational pull and became a really big black hole, because now everything is coming back to where it started. Because of this, things like stars and meteorites and everything else is slowly getting confined to a much smaller space, which means before we're wiped out by our sun getting big and exploding, we'll probably get hit by a meteor or run into another solar system. So don't worry about it. Love Shack is an operating system that supposedly contains the grand truth of the universe. Now, I'm an idiot when it comes to reading things like
the grand truth of the universe, and it's called Love Shack. That's interesting.
Operating systems, but from the best that I can make out, the idea is within the code of the Love Shack operating system is this grand truth, or essentially the one middle concept that all forms of human expression and science can be defined by. So supposedly, if you were to go within the operating system and enter something like a chemical equation, it will then convert that into calculus, it will convert that into forms of poetry, it can convert that into spiritualism and whatever. I said,
bro, this is what I'd be saying. I'd be saying it's all the same. I was saying it. I must be Love Shack. I must be the code itself. That you can find it in anything. Everything can be described by different things.
Essentially, this is supposedly a super duper top secret OS that allows people to discover the hidden truths within the universe because of its own hidden secret code. Retrocausality is something that I've mentioned before in the past, but it's going to get more attention here. The main idea being that things like cause and effect do not operate the way that we think it does. Instead, things simply happen and the universe corrects itself as a means of maintaining that end goal. It essentially comes down to the idea that there isn't really that much agency when it comes to what happens in the future, and instead things happen and therefore people align to it. And the reason it gives for this...
That's a scary thought. Retrocausality, do you hear that? There's not actually free will and things in the universe just happen and people just align themselves to it.
Is the idea that time itself exists as a dimension. And you've probably heard that before, but what it really means is that time is just our way of observing the universe. However, it's something that can be manipulated and we could definitely change. We just don't know how to yet, so while we view everything that
Boom! Well, I'll talk about this too.
Happens to us as being on a straight track, in reality things just kind of happen and there's not really a timeline to it. This has also been used as a means of explaining the Mandela effect. For example, things like the Monopoly Man. Most people, when they think of a Monopoly Man, think of him as having a monocle, even though he never did. So the idea is that we saw him at one point with a monocle. That's our memory of him. However, at some point in the future, he did not have a monocle, and for whatever reason, the timeline just favored that one and corrected itself. So now every iteration of him does not have the monocle. So whenever you apply that to larger scale things like human civilizations, wars, kingships, and what have you, you can theoretically get to a point, if someone were to understand this and to understand how retrocausality works, where there would be no unknown future. Or in other words, if things in our future are going to take place, and if time is just a construct that we've built for ourselves, then there should be ways to determine what is about to happen to us, because in terms of retrocausality, it's already happened. And not only things like predicting the future, but it can get to things like time travel, things like dimensional travel, and all that other cool stuff. Vaccine.
Boom, we're going to say another quote. Just from B.O.B. How is it self-prediction if they wrote the whole plot? I think with the whole retrocausality thing, I think there's some truth to it. Especially like I said, well, let's talk about the art of revision first. The art of revision has been studied, and technically that's a scientifically proven way to time travel. I don't know if I'm saying it in my own way, and like art of revision is a new tool, but it's basically, if something has ever happened to you in your life where it's causing an immense amount of trauma, something like that, maybe an ex, maybe an abusive mom, the way to, we're going to plug in enlightenment here, and consciousness and self-mastery, is through meditation. You go back to those memories, pull everything. Like, you know what? I'll just be honest here with this because I'm over it. I don't want to say it. Just be like, I was abused. My mom's boyfriend burned me, right? So there's more to that story, but we'll keep it on the short end for now. Pretty much, that caused a bunch of trauma, where it then started creating this ego that I moved through life with. In that ego, I had a belief that was, oh, can't trust adults. They're the same as kids. Like, wow, full grown man can do this to a kid, blah, 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 the whole 9 yards. So the fourth dimension as a dimension, instead of like, like time being a construct, all that, blah, blah, blah. With this, retrocausality is pretty much it how he said, we haven't been able to actually do that yet, or time travel. When you're going back, pulling back from those memories, you are time traveling, because you're pulling that trauma that you had in your past, and it could be continuously repeating in your present if undealt with. So the art of revision, and why I'm telling my story, is basically to go back to that moment and forgive them and revise it, or You don't even have to forgive. You have to do whatever, because remember, it's you against you. You have to do whatever your mind needs you to do, because again, the imagination is God, if you believe that, etc., etc. So if you need to kill someone off in your head to do that, go back in time and stomp somebody out. Go back and hang them to give you peace. That is time traveling. You're going back to a moment and basically you're releasing that from your energy, and that is time travel. Now, that ties into retro causality, if you can pick through how, because I'd have to go back and listen to him to put specific parts, but that is basically time travel. Now, the events, told you before, I told this story a lot about having visions of my grandma dying, the exact time, the exact date, what would happen, who'd be able to talk to her, nobody being able to see her, yada yada. I tried to warn my family of this, get into the whole, oh, blessed by the devil thing, da da da. Retro causality, if we tie that into it, is, I think, it's a better way to think about it. I think, like, I would say it's this, is all events, oh wow, that's actually tying in a deja vu too, that's crazy. Everything in creation is finished. So the law of attraction, if you think about that too, you're aligning yourself to a certain timeline of you, because the multiverse exists within you. If we're all our own separate universes, you're only aligning to a version of yourself that exists. So retro causality does have some weight in that, because technically, if you're going based on the law of attraction and changing your identity to align with a certain thing you want to experience, when you do that, you are in a form predicting, like, it's not like prediction, but it's like, it's weird. You're like grasping on something that already exists. It's weird. It's like how he said you're aligning with it. It's like that. You're aligning, but it's not exactly prediction. It's like you writing your fate. There we go. I think that's the best way to explain it. But that's cool. Retro causality.
Soul stealing is, let me clarify, because YouTube really likes to demonetize people who say the V word, especially in a video that has conspiracy theory in the title. As you're going to find out, it has nothing to do with modern political climates or modern political issues. As a matter of fact, this chart was made like 5 years ago, so again, nothing to do with that. And it isn't even saying something about all vaccines being bad, just one specific theory. I'm begging you, Susan, please do not take my money. Essentially, the idea is that in the early 2000s, the CIA got really interested in the concept of gene editing. Now, this is something from the MK Ultra experiments and other theories that I've mentioned on this iceberg that the CIA is definitely not opposed to doing. However, in this case, the CIA was interested in something known as the fundamentalist gene. The idea behind the fundamentalist gene is that it's a gene or actual section of the human brain that allows people to have a belief or calling to a higher power. In other words, there's parts of the brain that light up more with people who believe in things like religion and God as opposed to people who do not. So during the war in the Middle East, the CIA wanted to know if there was a way to sort of chemically castrate this. And supposedly, as the theory states, the CIA developed these vaccines that they handed out overseas in populations that they think may fall in line to a radicalization that is not in their favor. Or in other words, the CIA gave out medication to people that, unbeknownst to them, would cause them to lose their ability or focus on God and things relating to a higher power, as a means of making sure that they didn't fear any higher authority than the United States government. But I mean, I think at this point, you know, we can all agree that this is stupid and didn't happen. Like, come on, guys, we know the reason that the United States was in the Middle East was to get the zombie plague back from the Russian scientists. Like, it's really not that hard. But on that note, that is the end of Tier 9 of the Conspiracy Theory Iceberg. And as always, thank you for watching. Personally, I'm thinking that this iceberg has just got better as it's gone on. Yeah. And I love the fact that it went from just sort of these overarching or large ideas within, you know, culture and conspiracy things or well-known things that everyone knew, like Big Pharma. And it eventually got to like, yeah, there's a set of experiments of zombie plagues and things like that crazy out of, which speaking of, in the beginning, whenever I mentioned having to use the Wayback Machine to find this website, that was the whole Archon ear implanted parasite thing. It was from a website called like Galaxy Connections, which I've considered doing videos on stuff like that, but it's so much to set down and like the first sentence be like, so this was during the 8th year of the Orion Wars when the Star People were fighting the Archons. It's like it's a lot to take in at once. I still may do a video about it in the future, but it would definitely take time to understand any of what's being said, because I need like a thesaurus for every sentence. But that was tier 9. I hope that you enjoyed. If I seem a little tired or like sloppy voiced right now, it's because, for one, it's 4 in the morning, but also I have now recorded this 3 times in a row. I got halfway through, well, I got all the way through, like I did this entire video, this take and all of it, and then I look at my camera and it quit recording about halfway through when I was talking about Santiago interference. And then I was like, okay, so I record the second half again, and then I go look at my camera and it quit recording at the Sphinx one. So I've done this outro 3 times now, which, oh boy, I'm tired. But I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope I didn't juxtaposition. I always worry when something like that happens, it's going to go from me being like perky and happy to like depressed and bitter. And I hope that didn't come through any. I also want to say thank you all so much.
That was good. Yeah, I think I'm good for this one. I don't think I have much more to say. I think we covered it all there. Oh, shout out to all of you watching along with me. Oh, this was a long one. I felt him on that whole recording thing when you have to keep reshooting something, especially with reaction videos, because you want it to be one long stream. So sometimes if you do a reaction video that's super long, like especially when I was doing Warhammer ones, and OBS would freaking crash, you don't want to redo it, because if you redo it, it's almost like it's depending on what you say, it's almost like an inauthentic reaction. So I said I don't even do reactions. I'm basically like a commenter at this point. Anyways, much love and moonlight. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.